In this video, I'd like to talk about my process of writing and why I think it's an interesting way to cultivate your own sense of originality. I like to think of writing as a kind of frontier exploration. You're boldly going where no man has ever gone before. Your own inner life. In this sense, my words record something that has never been explored before. My own unique worldview. Just as a background for my own writing practice, I've been casually writing my entire life. It's something I've always been interested in. And in the past year and a half or so, I've taken it pretty seriously. If I've got one skill as a writer, it is productivity. In the past year and a half, I've written 2,000 pages. A lot of writing. And out of that writing has grown 2 books, lots of YouTube scripts, reams of poetry, journal entries, and lots of just free written nonsense. More on that later. In this video, I'm going to liken my writing process to fermenting alcohol. And with that in mind, before we get into writing specifically, let's talk about how beer gets made. So, if you want to make a beer, there's a tried and true system for making one, which has been honed over millennia of very specific practices. We found the best way to make a beer. You've got your water, your hops, your barley, and your yeast. You mix them all together and follow an exacting process of science and measurement, and you'll end up with the same product every time. You can make this specific beer. Put it on a shelf, sell it to people, they know exactly what they're going to get. We have all kinds of systems that work this exact same way, including writing a book. We kind of know the best way to write a specific kind of book. Follow the rules, you'll get there, you'll have a product that people will want to buy. But let's disregard all the best practices of beer making for a minute, and let's get really basic. If we go way back in time to the origins of alcohol, and you'll hear the word origin and the word originality as well, note that. If you go way back to the origins of alcohol, it was something kind of like this. Now, of course, you and I weren't there when alcohol was invented, so consider this an exercise in speculation. It's even more speculative because I don't know a whole lot about alcohol making. But maybe this will be entertaining, if nothing else. Imagine with me a tree stump. Long ago in the mists of time, this tree stump had a concave divot in it, the perfect shape for a bird to store some berries that it was collecting. But before the bird could move the berries away, there was a big rainstorm that filled this tree stump with the water and the berries. Over long passes of days, the berries and the water just sat there, got murky and full, and yeast started feeding off the sugars in the berries. And eventually, this water and berries turned into like a grog. This fermented sort of alcoholic kind of grog. One day, a squirrel was hopping around and decided he was thirsty. So he drank a little bit of water out of this tree stump and he got wasted. And he was like, wow, this is kind of a great feeling. I'm going to tell my friends. And a whole bunch of squirrels got together and they're all drinking out of this tree stump and having a party. Then some human happened by and saw all these squirrels acting real weird, but also seeming to have a really good time. So this brave human thought, maybe I'll try some of that grog water too. So this human drank some of the grog water, got drunk, and in due course, examining this delightful beverage, he figured out some way to replicate the process so he could share the goods with his friends. This is a very stupid example that is probably not accurate at all, but maybe it explains my point that behind the exact system of making a perfect bottle of Heineken, there was an underlying basic principle of fermentation. There's something very special about working from the basic principle that has a power to it that you don't get by working from the advanced system. And that's that with the basic principle, you have the potentiality for creating something totally original and new. Let's keep going with the principle of fermentation. Say we've got beer all figured out. We can make 1,000 different varieties of beer. But if you take it back to the basic principle, then say, what if instead of barley, we use smushy grapes? Boom, wine is invented. Say instead of smushy grapes, we put in honey. Boom, you got mead. Say you throw in some cabbage instead. Boom, kimchi is invented. Working from the very basic level is where all the potentiality is contained for making something new and fresh. As a culture, I think we are starving for originality. I don't think we can get enough of it. But because originality is difficult, because what's produced by originality is often not useful, instead most people content themselves with novelty, right? They want all kinds of different versions of beer instead of something new, right? You look at the grocery store shelves, it's all IPAs. But we need to think of new types of IPAs, something novel to get people to keep buying. So, all right, let's put some guava in the IPA instead. We're working at the very top level of the system. So instead of making something original, instead we're making something novel. Originality is like remixing from the basement level instead of from the rooftop level. And just like this applies to fermentation and making different types of alcohol, we could take this metaphor and apply it to writing as well. There are tried and true, proven ways of writing that you know are gonna make a product, something that maybe you could make a living off of. But you could imagine going to the principles of writing, going way back and getting really basic, and possibly being able to create something brand new that has never been seen before. There's obviously no promise that it would be useful or profitable, but it would be original. This is a very artistic way to think of writing. It's a type of writing that, rather than loaded with expected results, is jam-packed with exploration and surprise. Let's go back to beer again one more time for a moment. There's a type of beer called a saison beer. And whereas with most beers, you make them by using like a packet of yeast, like sort of an off-the-shelf kind of thing. With a saison beer, the yeast is just whatever's floating in the air, right? You have an open vat and you let the natural yeasts of the environment come in and use that to eat up the sugars and create the alcohol. And the outcome of that is you end up with a beer that has its own original, very peculiar and unique kind of tang to it. It's not something that you could replicate. It's something that is complex and wild. Whether you like this kind of beer or not, and whether you would like a writing process that was wild or not, one thing you can say about it is very distinct and lively. So making a saison beer is kind of like making a big surprise. You don't know what you're going to get. As an author, you could take this same principle and write from a perspective of surprise too. And it's actually maybe a lot more common than you'd expect. For fiction writing, for example, a lot of authors prefer to not exactly know where their story is going to go so that they write from a perspective of curiosity and surprise. For one, it's a way for the author to be more engaged with what's going on. And secondly, maybe that kind of curiosity would pass off to the reader in some sense. It'd be harder for the reader to know what's coming next if even the author didn't know what's coming next. Rather than sticking to the tropes that a reader has read a million times and could therefore maybe predict what's going to come next in that chain. When you're writing wild, just fermenting a story because you don't know where it's going to go, then it's harder for the reader to predict that as well. This sense of unknowing while you write is a part of nonfiction writing as well. It's a part of every writing. When you get down to it, what writing is, in a lot of ways, is a technology of thought. We aren't clear on our ideas, and one of the best ways to get stuff to cohere and organize is to write it. It's like the basic act of writing itself makes the ideas clearer to us. C.S. Lewis has a really good quote on this subject. He's talking about writing here, and he says, "First, I do not sit down at my desk to put into verse something that is already clear in my mind. If it were clear in my mind, I should have no incentive or need to write about it. We do not write in order to be understood. We write in order to understand." This idea of writing being a technology of thought is so interesting to me. I wonder how far you could take it. I want to double down on this sense of how much could I let the writing do the thinking for me? And what would that grow into if I got really, really good at that? That is the process of writing that I practice. And in this next section, I'll tell you where I'm going with it so far. So earlier I mentioned that if you work from a basic level, you're working from a level that is full of its potentiality still. If you want to make a beer, there's only so many things that you can make out of that, right? It's going to be a specification of beer. But if you work from fermentation, then it could be beer, could be wine, could be a brand new drink that nobody's ever heard of before. From the perspective of writing, when I think about what the most basic level of writing is, it would be scratching shapes on a page, before plans, before ideas, before your deep thoughts, before words even. Writing is just or and you might say, well, that's kind of useless, right? That's the equivalent of scribble scrabble. And yeah, scribble scrabble would be contained in that definition of writing. But also the most specified planning, the deepest ideas would also fit happily in that big, wide foundation. Working from this big, wide foundation is what I aim for in my writing, the bulk of my writing. And the word for that is free writing. Free writing is a practice where you just spew onto a page. No deliberation, you're just writing. And it could be anything, right? You could be writing nonsense. You could be writing your dream from the night before. You could be complaining about your boss or your parents. But the core quality is it's free, right? You're just letting it move unrestricted, right? Because the goal is you want a big body of creativity. And that's the foundation that I think every artist should work from. If you've got a big sea of potential that you're building off of, then there's a lot more energy behind your work and there's a lot more you can create. I didn't know that free writing existed. It's just something that I happened upon. And I guess now I can give you a brief summary of my story of how I got more serious about writing. A year and a half ago, I was working hard to become a professional painter. But somewhere in that process, I got so burnt out, I had to stop and decide, if I'm so tired from this, maybe it would be worth stepping back and seeing if there was some kind of creative expression that came out of me with less work. Something that maybe happened more naturally that didn't tire me out so much. So I decided to spend every morning at a coffee shop for an hour and a half and set aside a sacred time where I didn't have any kind of plan whatsoever. I just sat there. And if nothing happened, great. But maybe this would create an environment where some kind of creation, some kind of activity would happen out of me effortlessly and naturally. And the thing that happened as I sat there with nothing to do is free writing. I just blurted onto a page in like reams and reams of pages. Actually, it was iPhone notes because I do all my writing on the iPhone. But in a short manner of time, despite the fact that I was like totally burnt out, I produced like 500 pages of this free written nonsense. Writing was something that, for whatever reason, on some level, I could do effortlessly and spontaneously. This was a revelation to me that even in a burnt out state, I'd found this deep source within myself of like abundant productivity, lots and lots of writing. And there's another component to this that was affirming to me, and that's that when I went back and read what I had written, there was some value to it that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I wouldn't necessarily say it was good writing. I wouldn't necessarily say it was like coherent ideas, but there was like a magic to it. There was a charisma. There's something I really liked about this writing. What I think it was is this writing was self-expression. Of course you're going to like something that comes directly out of yourself. That's like the practice of making the exact thing that you would want to read, right? Self-expression. So even though it wasn't refined, even though it was very amateur in a lot of ways, I could sense the gem of value in this. There's something real special in here that my own unique soul was exactly suited to recognize and appreciate. Self-expression was going on here. What I decided was the factor that allowed this magic to come out in my free writing was the unintentionality that I had in the process. It was the fact that when I wrote, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a scheme. I wasn't analyzing the ideas as they came. I felt like the magic came about in my writing because I treaded softly in the process. Rather than trying to fix or analyze, criticize, or judge what was coming out, I treated this process of writing like you might treat walking up on a baby deer. Like you wanted to be real gentle so you didn't scare it away. I treated it the way you would like smoke in the air. If you start waving your hand around, like that smoke's gone. This magic was very delicate, and I felt that if I was somehow able to nurture this magic rather than shaking it off, then it could grow into something that was new and different, that had some spice that was compelling to me, and I felt like might be compelling to other people because it was jam-packed with my own enthusiasm. Intentionality has a way of like averaging out all of your ideas. I think of it as like one of those like magnetic grid lines on a computer where like if you bring the line kind of close, then it goes click and lands like right on there. Well, like intentionality and judgment is kind of like that too. You look at an idea from a black and white perspective and you say, oh, okay, I know what that is, click. But in that click process, everything is averaging towards like your preconceived notion, which means there's no room for something new to appear and grow. It's like the number 0.99 always gets rounded up to 1. But there's a certain kind of magic in that 0.01 that got wisped away from your intentionality, which is, kind of just like chasing off a baby deer that's drinking water in the woods. So the name of the game for me in free writing is to let things be vague. Let things be irrational nonsense. Just allow the writing to do the thinking for you and allow these ideas to grow up into whatever they're going to be. Just like, the C.S. Lewis quote from earlier, let the writing itself be the technology of thought rather than you're sitting and thinking yourself. Interesting ideas, original ideas, grow out of this. Because you're unintentional, you stepped back, all kinds of new wild things can appear, get nurtured and grow out of the process of unintentional writing. So now you've got this big ocean of free writing, and the question is, how are you going to bring it together into, some coherent material that people can read? And it turns out that if you write enough, there's going to be like an emergent sort of order to the stuff that you write. You're going to write about like similar topics, and in that similarity, like if you could bring those pieces of writing together, there would be like sort of a natural emergence of themes that come about from your writing. So for me, the way that I encouraged this along to like bring my writing together a little bit was I would, read through everything that I wrote. And then at the top of each section, I would just put a word as like a tag for like a general topical idea of what this section was about. So as an example, when I first started this process, a lot of what I wrote ended up being about the idea of like aimlessness as a good thing. So whenever I came across sort of writing something on that category, I would just tag the word aimless at the top of that section and keep moving. Then, I'd find a section about like unimportance as a good thing. And so I would tag the topic unimportance on the top of that. Then maybe I'd write something about laziness as a good thing. And so I'd tag laziness on that. Go through all my writing, and there would end up being a lot of things that were tagged aimless, unimportant, or lazy. If you take all those tagged sections and you bring them together into one note, then you end up with what looks like proto-chapters. And then if you look at those ideas together, you might see like kind of a relationship between all these chapters. And out of that, you could almost infer like a proto-book. It's weird. Like, I think usually our concept of writing has it going in the other direction. There's this thing I want to write about, so I'll make this outline. I'll have a chapter about this, about this, about this. In this chapter, I'll write about these things, and boom, then I've got a book. But this method really leans into like a kind of emergence. Rather than knowing what the heck kind of book I want to write about, I want to see what kind of book just shows up from my own naturalness. I talked about it being important to like preserve and to grow the magic of like your natural writing. And I think this tagging process is a great way to allow your weird, wild ideas to start to cohere together in some form without any of your intention. And what I think you get out of that is these living building blocks of wild, interesting ideas that you can then take your intentionality and work with. You could think of all of our like common ideas that everyone shares as like dried up dead building blocks in a sense. They're incredibly functional, but they become detached from like their originator. They're not being refreshed necessarily. They're just being iterated. And therefore there's like kind of a life lacking in them. But when you're creating ideas out of whole cloth, just like pulling from the yeast in the air to like ferment your brew, what you end up with are these like living blocks. They're like a little bit different than the blocks everyone else uses, but there's a kind of tang and life and freshness to ideas that came straight from you and are now being used to build a structure, a book. These are, I think, original ideas. So now you've got this collection of like living building blocks that you can use to make a book. And now your emphasis can turn towards planning and originality. Here the focus becomes like communication rather than creation. I've got some cool ideas, something interesting to say. And so now my focus in my work becomes almost that of like a translator. And ultimately, you're a translator of your own heart to other people. For example, the idea of aimlessness as a good thing means something to me now. I've written about it so much that in a sense I know it by heart. But the word aimlessness isn't going to mean that to anybody else. It's not the common way of using the word aimless, thinking of it as like a positive trait. So now my work is much like that of a translator. Other people don't know my sense. They don't know my foreign language, but I can work to communicate and convey this idea by good techniques, by good writing, and I can express something precious and valuable that I've discovered just from my journey into myself. Really, I'm working as a translator. I think the act of experiencing yourself and experiencing life holds all the magic in writing. It's like a translator's job. Like if I were translating from the French language to English, then my translation is only valuable if I know French at like a heart level, right? Like if I only know like a dictionary word for word swap, then like all of the magic, all of the tang of French is removed. As a translator, my value is that I know French, and so I can convey it over to English, hopefully in some way that wouldn't come across from like a word for word translation. This idea of experience as value, I think, is why you hear a lot of people say, like, if you want to be a writer or an artist, like first, just go out and live life. Go out and experience lots of things so that you have something to write about. Because it's what's in here that holds the magic in your art. So I'll finish by just talking about some of the outcomes of this practice of emergent writing, or whatever you'd call this. First, this type of writing is crazy productive. Turns out that like worrying and thinking a lot is a big energy drain. Surprise, right? So once all this thinking and worrying and planning is removed from the process of writing, it turns out that there's a lot of creativity in you that is usually kind of diverted away. Think of like, if I want to knock my friend over with a fire hose, I don't want it to all be spraying in one direction, right? If the fire hose has all these leaks in it that are like diverting the energy of the water out, then it's just going to like piddle on my friend and get him wet. This is a weird example. So if my creativity is undiverted by worries, then like I've got all the natural power in it and it's really impactful. If I worry too much or plan too much, then a lot of that energy gets diverted off. Second, this process is a process. You're not going to have like a final draft on your first draft. It takes more passes with this method before you finally end up with something that is like communicable and useful to people. It's kind of like in painting. Most painters don't like paint a single spot of the painting to like refined, finished perfection before going on to the next one. Like it's more natural to like bounce around, you know? Stuff is loose all over and it only slowly kind of comes into refinement after many, many passes. This practice of writing is like that. And finally, although this process is more inefficient than a more direct method of writing, what you get in exchange for it is a writing that is full of your own unique spirit. Because every step of the way, you've been cultivating these wild wisps of magic of your own perspective. As you've allowed those to grow, it's become building blocks that are loaded with charisma. They're loaded with originality. They're a little bit different, a little bit spicier than the off-the-shelf ideas that people are usually working with. This, I think, is the greatest sell for this method, that by allowing stuff to grow out of absolutely nothing, out of the total base, I end up with something that is full of a compelling originality. I don't think we could ever get enough of that. And finally, before we go, I have a gift I would like to share with you. If you would like to create more, but you find that your creative time is often slow, stressful, or even exhausting, I have something that I think can help. I've written a free 20-page ebook called The Art Garden, where I share a dead simple strategy for making your creativity easier. You can find the link down in the description. Just click the link, put in your email address, and I'll send it your way. Thanks. Happy art making.